Outlaw gangs in the West were extremely violent. They robbed everybody in the town, tied them all up, and looted all the businesses and homes. Tiburcio Vasquez, he was bad, bad, bad. Anybody who tells you the difference is naive.
He's a bandit, and that's what only people hear. They don't understand that the history is a lot more complex than that.
Even when he was in jail, all the women would come up to him and give him love notes and all that type of stuff. I mean, that's the guy's bravado. That's his legend.
He was known as the gentleman bandit because he was very handsome. Ladies thought he was incredibly good looking.
He loved women. He was charming. He was very skilled at seducing señoritas, but they were eventually his downfall.
He's sometimes considered a hero, sometimes considered an outlaw.
Did they really have the ability to melt down a single 500-pound chunk of silver? And if they did and Vasquez stole it, how's he going to get rid of it?
Vasquez is pointed out sometimes as a social bandit. What kind of social bandit fires into a house occupied by prostitutes and wounds an innocent woman?
Somebody's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. But I think he initially started as a freedom fighter.
Tiburcio Vasquez was the most infamous Hispanic outlaw of the Old West.
Hey! So, to treasure hunters, an area like that is awesome. It's just an old rundown, who knows what was there, what kind of building. It's obviously some sort of a home. And that's the type of stuff we will go into and search. You might find a coin dated 1923, 1934, 1880, and that's the cool stuff. Goes in there, that turns down. That clicks in. And that's pretty much it. Set it up. Well, if I'm looking for Vasquez gold, the first thing I would do is look at the last 2 or 3 places he robbed, because that's probably going to be fairly fresh. I wouldn't necessarily look at what he robbed 2-3 years down the line, because if I'm a crook, that stuff would have been gone already.
Hilarious. You don't go risk your neck getting shot at by posses and risk getting lynched to then bury your treasure in the ground.
Is there still stuff out there? There could be. Where is it? Who knows?
If he did even minimal research, he would have known that Tiburcio never did any robbery anywhere in that area, and certainly didn't bury any treasure. He spent it.
I think Vasquez is an incredibly interesting story. And wouldn't it be great if somebody was to find some of that stuff today?
Before the Mexican-American War, which was 1846 to 1848, Americans had been coming into California and really hoping to strike it rich and get land. From the get-go, there seemed to be a sense of entitlement by many of the Americans, even though this was Mexican sovereign land.
I think that he grew up in a rough situation, a lot of racism. Californians overnight became strangers in their own land. I think that had a deep effect on him.
And he was very upset because he was not being treated with respect by the Anglos. He was a very proud man. He was not willing to conform or be a part of this disrespect. He asked his mama for blessing to be an outlaw.
But his mother, Doña Guadalupe Vasquez, certainly did not condone it. She'd walk to Mass every morning. This is not the kind of woman that would tell her son, yeah, it's okay to be a robber.
But he would come visit his sister who lived here, which was right across the street from the jail where he had spent time. So that's kind of characteristic, I think, of his daring, his walking the edge.
If you went through a random selection of convicts at San Quentin, you wouldn't find anybody like Tiburcio Vasquez. He was educated for the time. He loved to write poetry. He wrote in a beautiful hand. He was extremely intelligent, and he was a natural leader of men.
We begin with Tiburcio Vasquez back in the news. A new Salinas Elementary School has been named in his honor, but since we first told you about that, there has been growing opposition and controversy.
Before the school opened up, there was a new board that was very reform-minded and had ideas of reinvigorating the community. Because the original European settlers in this area were Spanish, the reform-minded people in this town believed that they would inspire the community to feel proud about their roots. One of their roots was Tiburcio Vasquez. Many know him as a bandit, but a lot of people, some people in the Latino community specifically, people who believe in change, see him as a figure that was willing to stand up to the Anglo invaders, how they believed it at the time. When the community found out about it, specifically people of Anglo roots, they complained.
Shame on the school board in Salinas, you don't know your history. I mean, all they had to do is read the newspaper and they'd have seen that my book had just come out. So to me, that was very frustrating that I spent 40 years off and on working on this book, and then they don't even know about it, and then they name the school after him. If they had maybe come out and said, look, we understand that Tiburcio Vasquez was an outlaw and a robber, but what we're trying to do is illustrate how bad racism was.
The name Cesar Chavez used to be controversial, and some people believe that by invoking the name of Cesar Chavez, they would be able to convince a lot of people that the name Tiburcio Vasquez would eventually become a name that people would accept. People here in the community did not want to have to be answering to these kinds of questions. They just wanted to have a sanitized name that would be palatable to everybody.
When he did the robberies in the towns, those were much more risky because everybody had a gun back then. So Vasquez had enough sense to not do something like that. The towns that he did go into to do a robbery were very small, a few hundred people at the most. Most of his robberies were highway robberies, but in 1873, he and his gang committed what became known as the Tres Pinos Massacre. Tres Pinos, Vasquez decided to rob the general store. His usual MO was to go in, get all the people at gunpoint. He tried to avoid violence, but the whole robbery went haywire. One of the gang shot the guy that tried to flee. Then this started kind of a general shooting, and finally the storekeeper was shot dead when a guy that was later identified as Vasquez fired through the front door of his home and killed this man named Leander Davison. It's really the only time I'm aware of in Western history that an outlaw gang robbed an entire town.
It's a story. The biggest treasure here is not necessarily gold and silver. The biggest treasure is the story itself. Johnny Depp, Captain Jack Sparrow. There's more to treasure than silver and gold.
The stories that he buried gold, those are all just myths. These outlaws, what they like to do is they like chicks and they like gambling and they like to drink, so they'd blow their money as quickly as they got it. And the idea that Tiburcio would go bury his money, of which there are countless stories, is just cuckoo. That kind of thing did happen. If they did a robbery, and say they did a stage robbery and stole a Wells Fargo box full of gold, and the posse was closing in, they'd hide or bury the treasure, but then once they lost the posse, they'd go right back there and get it.
That's what those guys have to go off of to find out where the treasure actually is. And Wells Fargo is notorious for not giving you a lot of information because they want to find it. They still got gold missing.
So when Tiburcio would get hot, he'd head up to, on one occasion, all the way up to Mendocino County, where he had relatives. He'd go down to Los Angeles County, where he had relatives. And blood was thicker than water back then, and he would be protected and harbored by his family and also by his friends.
Vasquez did spend 2 nights here at the Andreas Pico Adobe. He was sort of against the people coming west and wanted to take over California from Mexico.
Captain John Adams, who, unlike the lawmen in Monterey County, was a great, what was called a thief taker back then. He was a great manhunter. He raised a posse, an emergency posse, and took off after Vasquez and trailed him all the way south to Los Angeles County, had a gunfight with Vasquez, and was unable to capture him. Vasquez managed to escape. But Tiburcio realized at that point, Northern California is way too hot for me. I think I'm going to stay down here in Los Angeles.
He knew where he could hide out and who would help him and who wouldn't help him. And he also knew when to come in and when to leave so that everything would be okay. There was a silver baron who had a lot of silver, and he knew Vasquez was in the area. So what he did was he poured out 2 500-pound nuggets, and Vasquez stole one of the nuggets. And he goes, "I thought we were friends. Why did you steal?" He says, "We are friends. That's why I only took one." Once that nugget is that huge, how are they going to melt it back down? How did he get rid of it? Is it still theoretically up in Vasquez Rocks?
He finally ended up holding up in the adobe of a guy named Greek George Allen. His wife was a very attractive California woman. So Tiburcio then started fooling around with her, and that eventually she found out that he had also gotten his niece pregnant, and she was so furious about that, she went and reported those facts to the sheriffs, and that eventually led to Tiburcio's capture.
Most treasure hunters spend a lifetime and really don't find too much.
A photograph of Tiburcio, an exemplar of his handwriting, if you could find one of his love letters, those are the real treasures of Tiburcio Vasquez. When we're asking today in the cold light of day with 100 years of hindsight, was he a good guy or a bad guy? He was a bad guy, a very bad guy.
The history of Tiburcio Vasquez is very challenging to understand. You cannot understand Tiburcio Vasquez in contemporary times. He was a hero for the Latino community at the time, and he was a villain for the Anglo people who had just arrived to take this land as their own.
To you, Vasquez could be a hero. To me, he could be an outlaw. It doesn't matter. It's okay to have a difference of opinion. My thing is, I like the guy, I like the mystique of him, I like the historical aspect of him. But at the bottom line is, if he was coming down the road, would I give him help? No, I'd run like hell. Because I know that either way I'm going to be in trouble or the guy's going to kill me. And that's what he was about.